I'd like to welcome Jon Fila to present to us about AI in education this afternoon. Please go ahead, Jon.
Thanks, Barbara. My name is Jon Fila. Right now I'm an English teacher in an asynchronous online program. It's a supplemental program in Minnesota called Northern Star Online. And what might also be relevant later is that I'm also helped start and facilitate what I think is the largest OER K-12 initiative in the state of Minnesota, maybe the country, called the Minnesota Partnership for Collaborative Curriculum. And I'm used to presenting on topics like OER and accessibility, things like that. So I usually don't get a lot of attendance in these. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you about AI today. So thank you for spending the next few minutes with me while I walk through some of what I'm struggling with, some of how I'm thinking about this, and what I think we need to be aware of as we move forward. So, like everyone else in the classroom, about last November, December, I started seeing some really odd student submissions in my classroom. And at the same time, I was also dealing with some chronic pain issues. So I had a lot of time on my hands just to kind of dive into this topic. And the more I had to do and keep my mind off of that, the better. So I really just started diving into this, what is this ChatGPT thing right away. So as I was digging and finding more tools and more applications, the student submissions were getting stranger and stranger. And I teach primarily seniors. One of the last classes they need to graduate was, the English 12 class. So I'm seeing a lot of people trying to kind of get through the class that way. So while all that was happening, I just started writing, right? So I put out a student guide and some resources and videos, and then that led to an educator guide, and then which led to a longer book just on embracing AI in education at all levels and talking about different problems that we face and challenges and how we might use AI to start dealing with some of those issues. What I think is unique about these AI tools has to do with how innovation spreads. And I know we've had a lot of challenges, in my 20 plus years of teaching, where it was difficult to get new initiatives off the ground. And so we really started focusing as a district on how innovation spreads and takes hold. Most people don't find themselves in that innovator and early adopter category. And so, we talk about how do we get widespread adoption? How do we get that initial, 40, 50% of people using the tools so that the diffusion can really start to take place? And what's interesting about tools like ChatGPT and some of these other AI platforms is that that's already really been done. We already have, over 65% of teachers that have started using these tools. We have at least a third of students that are already using them, and that was without any kind of directive from our districts or organizations themselves, and without really any training. So the fact that the hard part of diffusing this innovation has already taken place, we can really start to think about what is the relative advantage of adopting these tools, making sure that we can think about why this is better than what we've done before, start thinking about the kind of time it will help us save and the different populations that it will support. We talk about compatibility. I happen to make comparisons to these tools, not just to things like calculators or the internet, but things like cell phones, the more disruptive things that we still face challenges with, and students' interactions and engagement with technology. The complexity around these tools, I know at first while they may seem pretty complex, these tools aren't magic. They are programmed to answer our questions, even if they don't know the answer. So they want to please us. So it really hasn't been that complex. We can just get on and start asking it questions and start having conversations with it. What we like to do in our district is call everything a pilot. So we want to start small groups of people using these tools, demonstrate ways in which it's already being used, and what we might look forward to in the future. And then we want to be able to measure these results and compare student performance and interests and the conversations that they and other staff members are having around these kinds of tools. So when we start thinking about students using AI, the first thing that everybody was worried about, myself included, was that they're using it to cheat. That's nothing new. To educators, students have always tried to cheat. They've always tried to find shortcuts to try to lighten their workload, and many have done so quite successfully. But what I really wanted to focus on is that the idea that students notice hypocrisy right away. If we tell them they can't use it, or if we're blocking these tools on their devices, and then they see us, on the other hand, using these tools to lighten our workload and to create more engaging activities or resources and quizzes, they notice that, right? And that can start to hurt our relationship with them. So I really didn't want to get anything in place that might set up that kind of contentious relationships with my students. So what I started looking for were, what are some appropriate ways of students using this kind of work? What if they're not just using it to write their papers for them? What if they just want some initial support and help? What if they need it to break down some assignment directions? What if they're going to use it to help them with a rough draft, or even brainstorm the ideas for their rough draft? And so I really tried to figure out what some of those categories might look like for my learners. And while I was trying to detect students who were using it, I noticed right away that that probably wasn't a sustainable practice for me. It was taking 5 times as long to grade assignments, just because I was trying to figure out, which students were using it and which ones, really just needed the extra support. And so I kind of developed some sample policy language around these ideas around AI-assisted original work, what responsible use looks like, and what I consider to be plagiarism, just flat out copying and pasting something into their response that they didn't write. But we want to trust our students' ability to use these tools responsibly, and with the goal of enhancing their learning experience rather than just flat out doing it for them. And so the reason why I talk about detection being a myth was because it fails in all kinds of areas. We're disproportionately impacting different populations of students. We know that English language learners, for instance, or autistic students are being flagged as having written AI remarks, and even some of my own writing from my course or directions to students. I noticed when I plugged it into these detection tools, it was flagging that as AI generated. And I think because of the way these tools are trained, they are meant to sound like us, and they are meant to sound like us in a way that is the most kind of predictable way possible. So if we're writing for clarity, it is going to flag those ideas and concepts at much higher rates. So I've moved away from using them. And one of the reasons for that, even before I learned about some of these other categories, was because it was setting up a really contentious relationship with my students. And because they're asynchronous, and if they're starting early off in the class, I don't want my first interactions with them to be, arguing with them over whether or not they're using AI, right? Or having to deal with some of the hassle of then, going up to parents or administrators because some, we're approaching that level. So I really started to change my language around that, that I'll get to in just a bit. Here's a screenshot from the Clone Wars. But what I think is interesting is that the more that we interact with these kinds of tools, and you notice that the article that I linked to here was written in November 2018, which had to do a lot with people interacting with these bots on social media. And so the more we interact with these kinds of tools, the more we will start to sound like them. We ask students who are becoming writers that, the best way to become a good writer is to read a lot. And so as students are reading a lot of AI generated content, they will start to sound more like AI. I remember a few years ago when people were talking about how toddlers were developing British accents in the United States, and it had a lot to do with the media they were consuming, things like Peppa Pig, where they were developing these accents. So, and I think in a lot of ways, this is similar, where now we are starting to sound more and more like AI, and it's becoming harder and harder for us to distinguish what is AI and what is human. Only about half of people right now are able to distinguish that by reading about it. I think teachers are probably a little bit further along on the curve because now we have read so much student AI content that we're getting better and better at detecting that just kind of with our own instincts. But even then, we're kind of limited by our own implicit biases. So we may also decide something was AI when it really was something written by, for instance, the ELL student or the autistic students that I referenced previously. I found this post on Twitter where someone was talking about an email response they received where they were told the AI design of your email is clever, but significantly lacks warmth. Would it be possible to be contacted by a human being moving forward instead of AI? And so he responded, it's not AI, I'm just autistic. See you next Friday. So I really started to think about, early on that the detection isn't where we were going to kind of support our students and develop those relationships with them. I saw it more of an equity issue. So for one, because I teach students around the state of Minnesota that are in different school districts with their own policies and practices around AI, many of them were banning the tools on district devices, on district networks. So then I had some students who could use it, some who couldn't, some who were able to access these kinds of things through the networks on their phone. So right away, I had an equity issue where not everyone had access to all of the same tools. I also, know how these tools are trained. They are trained with large bits of information written by humans that have their own implicit biases. So when we talk about the whole concept of garbage in, garbage out, and most of what we've written as humans, in the past has been maybe biased at best and white supremacists at worst, then we are receiving responses based on tools that are also trained on these things that we've been trained on as humans. So I really wanted to think about whose voices have been left out in the material that the tools were trained on, in the programmers and the guardrails they set up to help avoid some of the pitfalls of some of the early AI tools that were out there that very quickly were turned racist and homophobic, misogynistic. And so, I know that they're doing their best to combat those kinds of issues in ways they hadn't previously. But then I also was thinking about like these real world examples that we have in our own kind of points of view and how we communicate and present material to learners. And then how is this going to help us overcome some of those, or would it help, as kind of solidify some of those beliefs? And so for me, as a language arts teacher, being able to bring in more kinds of media literacy and a focus on that more than I've been able to before, and encourage other subject areas to do that, it felt like that was a more important aspect of what I was doing. I like to use it to help me come up with strategies to help meet the needs of students with various characteristics who are struggling, which I'll get to a little bit more. But I do see effective prompt engineering as a new form of literacy. And the students who are going to be able to do that well are going to, I think, be much further along than the students who are banned from using these kinds of tools. So that I've focused a lot in my career on creating accessible materials. I've most of my career I've taught in non-traditional settings. And so I've been faced with some of these challenges a lot. And I started to see a lot of how I was thinking about AI had a lot to do with how I was thinking about providing accessible materials for students, and why it was good for educators for us to do that, and why it was good for students to do that. and primarily I like to focus on the reason why we would want to use these tools for our learners. And for them, less time figuring out the individual accommodations to focus on their content was a pretty big gain for me. Where students who may be able to access these kinds of tools essentially had their own personal tutor at the tip of their fingers. And so when I start to think about the different types of disabilities, AI can help us unlock strategies to meet the needs of a lot of these categories, if not all of them. So if I'm plugging in ideas for assignments, lessons, quizzes, different kinds of assessments, I can right away in my prompts have it identify some of these categories and ask it to address those concerns within the lessons themselves. So then I, by default, start to get different types of responses from the AI than just the default responses that they were trained to give. So I started using it right away to just get and share ideas, kind of talk to it about what I was doing, the way in which I was doing it. It would provide some suggestions or help for me and start to think about things in a different way that I hadn't thought of previously. I know that when teachers use OER, it's the same kind of issues, right? Awareness is a big one. So the lack of awareness presents its own set of challenges. Teachers are using OER to do all of these same bullet points. But just like, the adoption of an innovation I talked about earlier, I wanted students to start to see those factors of an innovative practice, that the relative advantage, is it better than what it replaces? How close is it to what we were doing before? Is it easy to understand? How can we start to try it in some low risk kinds of settings? And so when I communicate with my students who I felt like were using AI in their assignment generation, instead of saying something that was flat out accusatory, I started to change my language around this and say, this sounds a little AI-ish to me, and try to use that as an opening to a conversation with that student and figure out why it was they were like hiring this tool, right? Why did they feel the need that they had to engage that rather than relying on me as a source of support? And so I get that it does give them ideas for breaking down assignments, for time management, strategies for reducing anxiety, especially around their academic workload. I've noticed that by plugging in, a lot of IEP or 504 plan accommodations, it will give me ideas for how to address some of those issues. And so I started kind of playing around with the idea of extra credit assignments, where I would have students use the tool if they wanted to. Now, because they have to set up an account with almost all of these tools, I didn't want that to be required. So the students who chose to were able to, for kind of a supplemental assignment, actually go on, see me in a video using the tools to create an assignment submission, and then talk about, in my example, why is social media harmful for teens? Or, what are the dangers of social media for teens? And it will give you a paragraph that sounds good and hits some of the right points. But then I wanted them to see that you could sufficiently alter those kinds of responses. So what would it sound like if you asked it to write that same response but sound like Yoda? And so once I could show them the kinds of differences in their prompts, then we could start getting into what does that editing process look like? And I created a series of bullet points for them about how to go in and make some of the changes necessary to make this something that's more reflective of them, their culture, and their lived experiences. What should they take away? Where do they need to create some citations and provide some verifiable sources to support the claims made in their AI source? So that became something that I started to use with them. One, just so that they knew that I'm well aware of these tools. I know what they're capable of, and I'm experienced enough that I can see what an AI response looks like. And so that, I think, kind of helped build a closer relationship with them, because they didn't see me as someone disconnected from the experiences that they were having as these tools are integrated into just about every field that they'll ever come into contact with. And so I drafted some language around that where, I'll kind of copy and paste or some version of some of the phrases on this feedback response where, I talk about, we don't want to sound like machines. Machines can do that. I want to hear what they have to say about it and what sounds more like them, what's more reflective of them. And so they can go ahead and use some of those detection tools if they want to. But it's really important now that what they write is more than what AI can write, because if it isn't, then what's the point? I've talked to people, and myself included, developing curriculum with AI around a set of academic benchmarks. And if I can do that, and the students are using AI for their assignment submissions and their assessments, and I could also use AI to provide feedback to those learners, then what are we really doing? What's the point of all this? So being able to really have some honest conversations about what's really important in the class, what do I want them to be able to do, and how can they use it to help lighten the workload and some of the anxiety that comes with that. When I'm doing my course planning now, things look substantially different than they did before. What would have taken me days and days, to write a unit for a class, I can now have something created, relatively quickly within one day. We had a workshop in our district around creating assessments, and with my team, I started working with AI while the team was working to create out of the academic benchmarks their I can and this means statements. We had it create a summative assessment for a literary analysis essay. We had it create the rubric and the scoring guide. And you can see it goes on and on and on in each level of rubric criteria. And I wanted to have it create examples for students about what a 25 would look like for this paper, so that they had these exemplars to work from, some prerequisite skills, the learning intentions. So it was doing all of this. As an English language arts department, this kind of work would have taken us the entire day. I had this done in about 7 minutes, and we could spend the rest of our time together with the cognitive load that we had available to argue about it all and decide what was good about that, what still needed some work. And we ended up creating some products that were well beyond what we would have been able to do in the past, because just the creation around all of that material would have exhausted us. But now we had the capacity to actually have conversations about it. So I think what's interesting about these AI platforms is I've had more conversations with my colleagues now in the last year than I've had in many years previously, because we are talking about our practices again. We are talking about what an appropriate assessment is, how we make accommodations in our different settings within our district. So when we were working with the academic standards, for instance, here's a history one, for instance, where I gave ChatGPT for the academic benchmarks and had it create a lesson around that. So it's giving me the introduction and the activities and the closure, the assessment, the extensions. It even created a script for me to use with my learners. So that having that as a rough draft really helped free up my time to start thinking about what might be more interesting for my learners to do. And what I think is really important that I want to highlight here today is the idea that, I'm fond of saying that the default version of everything sucks. And I think that tools like ChatGPT are the same. The default version is not good enough. So if you ask it to create a lesson related to the hanging in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862, you'll get a standard lesson that has the objective, the introduction, the assessment, and all that. But in my ChatGPT profile, I have it focused on things like social emotional learning, on anti-racism, on using inclusive language, on using multiple perspectives, so and accessibility, universal design for learning, all of these things that I preload into my profile of ChatGPT so that when I get responses, I get something that's sufficiently different from what the default lesson might be. And so you can see a more culturally responsive lesson, by incorporating all those elements, is doing all kinds of things that by default, the tools are not necessarily inclined to do. And so in the objectives, you can see instead of just understanding the events, they're critically examining the events, including various perspectives. They're reflecting on the complex issues surrounding the tragic events. They're highlighting a Dakota Sioux perspective and the impact of broken treaties. They're acknowledging different subject matter. They're exploring viewpoints, lack of fair representation. So all of these things, and then they're even able to role play and debate and collaborate on projects and focus on the complexity of historical events and the importance of those multiple perspectives. That's where I kind of see it as the adversary versus assistant, right? The title of today's talk, because it could certainly do those things, but it's not helping us. It's not helping our learners if we don't push beyond those default prompts and responses that we're given. We have to, by default, then tell it how we want it to respond to us, and even respond to us if it doesn't know the answer, so it doesn't hallucinate and make something up. So that, if you don't take anything else out of today, I think that's the most important part for me, is that we're using it in a way that really helps get at some of the equity and inclusion issues and some of the biases that were inherent in traditional public education in this country. So when we're engineering our prompts, we want to, I'm really fond of giving it examples. So for instance, we use Moodle as our learning management system, and I could ask ChatGPT to create a 30-question quiz in XML format so that I can import it into Moodle. So I can use 5 random questions from a question bank. And so it will do that, and I import those, and it gives me an error. But if I take one that I know that works and give ChatGPT the example, it will format it in the way that document does. And I noticed with math problems in particular, the ones, especially with word problems, that they tend to struggle with, if you give it an example of a problem that's similar to what you are trying to ask it and explain those steps, then within the context of each chat, it will know how to respond to those things. It will be able to break these down. And I notice the order of your prompt requests can matter. So I'm usually starting with the end in mind, just like I develop curriculum. I'm kind of asking for what the result I want first, and then I start to feed it some specifics and continually bringing it back to focus. When it's not giving me the kind of response I want, I stop it. I don't just accept that default tool. I want it to be a true assistant for me. And so I kind of give it incremental bits, and I can use tools like Claude, where I can paste all of the English language arts benchmarks for a particular grade and have it help create course outlines on those and make sure that all of the standards are being addressed. And so by being able to upload documents that have much more text than a prompt in ChatGPT allows, I can use one tool for some of the heavier lifting around large, some of text. And then when I want to drill down onto things and using the kind of inclusive language that I was talking about, then I'll take it to ChatGPT and help kind of flesh out what some of these lessons might look like. And I want to continue to tell it what it's getting wrong. So, when you give it the permission to do that, it will still think it's answering your question, even if it doesn't know. So I'm constantly asking it for more examples. What am I missing? What are some of the whys? Why would a student want to be able to meet this particular academic benchmark? What are the real world examples where that's useful? And ChatGPT and Claude can do a great job at that. They'll give me a list of all kinds of reasons why these skills are relevant in the real world, or why it's beneficial to them and their communities. And so when I get those kinds of lists, I'll just continue to ask it a couple times, are there any more? And it'll always, come up with some more. And then I can cherry pick from that long list things that I think will speak to my students. And I will continue to ask, what is some of the potential for bias around these topics? And I can start to wrestle with those. That I finally have the energy to kind of do and review. I think what's interesting is I've worked in 4 different school districts in my career, and in not one interview was I ever asked about my subject area or my expertise in that subject area. Well, now I think that's more important than ever, because if we're using these AI tools to help us create curriculum and to help us, lighten our workloads, we need to be able to verify these responses. So we can't necessarily take a first-year teacher and just teach them the right prompts, incorporate SEL, make it accessible, make it inclusive, make it, incorporate multiple perspectives and anti-racist and all of these elements, because when they get their response, they haven't necessarily had the 20 years of PD that I've had around those topics to be able to evaluate those responses. So again, helps us bring colleagues together and start to talk about where these tools are supporting that work and where these tools still need some, tweaking, and where those responses need to be fleshed out by someone with a little bit more expertise. And so now having an expertise in that subject area becomes even more important than it ever has. What I like to do with students to just kind of help them avoid the temptation to use AI for assignment submissions is I will just flat out give them the AI response first. So here's the assignment. This is what AI has to say about this assignment. Now I'm curious to know what you think about this. You could even say, here's the AI response. And instead of having students answer the same questions or write an essay, you could have them go out and use the skills that they're developing to find and provide citations and credible information that supports or refutes the claims in that AI response. I'm on the side working on an independent comic book right now, and I didn't know anything about the industry when I set about doing that, but I had AI help develop some marketing plans around that so that I was able to find ideas and ways to get that comic book out there that I couldn't do before because I just didn't know what I was doing. And so it gave me examples, and I can ask it the kinds of what if questions. And that to me brings up a lot of use cases in schools where students who may have to develop a plan or develop an idea or something that they want to market for a business class, for instance, now they can actually do that with some real feedback that could get their tools and their games or their products out the door in front of an actual audience, when before we were limited in resources and how to even help teach them those kinds of things. Having it help create agendas for our professional learning communities. So we have a whole year's worth of PLC tasks that we can use as an English department, centered around AI and how we're integrating and using it. We go out and try some of those ideas and come back and talk about it again, bringing colleagues together, talking about their practices. In our district, we don't just set SMART goals for our school improvement plans. We add the inclusive and equitable aspect to those goals as well. And ChatGPT is well aware of what these are, so we can have it develop our SMARTY goals, and then we can decide which ones are the ones we want to focus on based on kind of the work that our committees are doing. I also was thinking about, younger students, and for a 4th grade English language arts lesson, could it create a Dungeons and Dragons style game for students to play in the classroom if what was a traditional kind of lesson and instruction wasn't really reaching them? And I had my son in mind for this. So this one was an 8th grade assignment. So it's using all these resources I share. This one's Creative Commons license. So, the prompts that I'm using, the standards that I'm plugging into it, and the why behind it, because I'm always fond of telling the students why it is we're spending our time on this. Time is the most valuable thing we have. And if we're going to take a chunk of class time to do this, why is it important to them? So here we go. We've got the game, the word craft, quest for verbal mastery, and it gives them time for character creation and gameplay, sets up a series of quests and challenges, from the verbal tower and the punctuation dungeon all the way up to the labyrinth of language conventions. And so ChatGPT can essentially serve as the dungeon master for these students who are coming up with their scenarios and their sentences. So while hitting the academic benchmarks. So to me, those kinds of experiences for learners are exciting, and I can create endless quizzes just for quick formative assessments or practice. So if a student tells me they're really into the One Piece anime, I can have it reference shows they like, movies they like, books they like, and take the content from the course and have it reference those things they like so that they can see parts of a story, for instance, and start to analyze, if they're into Harry Potter, things like, the plot diagram or character analysis, things like that. So more inclined to do those kinds of things around topics they like. What I think we need to be very careful of, and I'll kind of end with this warning, is we have to be able to talk about this to the public. We have to be well versed in what the tools are, what they're capable of, where they fail, and how we're using it. Because we've seen a lot of very contentious school board meetings over the last few years, and there's a lot of toxic attitudes out there about AI having a liberal bias, or we're just using it to do our work for us, and what do they need us for? So we have to be able to deal with that kind of resistance and how we approach that from parents and community members, and empathize with their concerns around, and still advocate for the benefits of using AI. So I'm all for transparency and how I'm using it, and creating policy language around that, talking about how we're having committees review the responses before we put it in front of students. How is it reviewed? What are appropriate and inappropriate uses? How are we including equity and inclusion into these? And how are we training teachers on how to use them? So I've got looks like about 3 minutes left. If you want to follow up with me, be happy to hear your thoughts, field any questions, or hear your reactions. You can contact me on Twitter at Jon T. Fila. There's my website and email address. So if anyone has a question they want to put in the chat, I'd be happy to spend the next couple minutes talking about that. Maybe people don't have access to the chat. I should have asked that.
People do have access to the chat, and we're a small enough group. If anybody would like to unmute their mic and show themselves on camera, we do have just a couple minutes.
So what I like to do is just turn on the fire hose and throw as many things at you, and hopefully some of it sticks with you and provide some pause for thought and reflection, and things you can actually go out and try. The resources I shared with you are available to share in the uploaded presentation. And so I'm happy to continue to create those kinds of things and put them out into the world. Got about 2 minutes left if you have a question. Can I give an example of how I'm working with students whose schools have blocked access? Yeah, so we talk a lot about what you can do on your own device if you are not using a school device, or if you are using your phone, you could use it that way. Or I will also ask students to share with me what they would want to know from AI, and then I will plug that in for them, or we'll set up a synchronous session where I'll open it and share my screen, and then we'll have that interaction with the tools together so that we can kind of see what we have to do to get the kind of response that's going to be suitable for the work that they're doing, and that will meet my expectations. So I really, just like with colleagues, I think it will open up more conversations with students so that I can have those kinds of conversations with them. but that's tough when they block access. I know there's still districts blocking YouTube. They're not going to be blocking it for long because it's really embedded into just about everything. If they're using Google Apps, it's embedded into Google Docs. It's embedded into so many aspects of what they're using already, even in their search engines. So blocking it seems pointless at this point. We need to have policies around safe and effective use. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I appreciate it. Like I said, I know time is all we really have, and I appreciate you spending part of your time with me.
Thanks very much, Jon. That was a lot of helpful information. I've tried to follow a lot about AI and ChatGPT, and you really talked about some things I didn't know about, provided some resources I didn't realize that you had put together. So I really appreciate that. I think all of our attendees do as well. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Jon. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye.